I was 24 years old, working 3 jobs, and one Tuesday in November I walked into a refrigerated warehouse on the east edge of the city and asked the girl who had been following me for a year to lock me in a room and handle the rest of my life. She had already built the room. She had told me about it herself, 6 weeks earlier, standing at a bus stop, in the tone another person would use for a dentist appointment. It was not a cell. It was a 2-room apartment, fully furnished, standing free in the middle of a freezing warehouse under sodium lamps, with a fake window that dimmed at sunset and my dead mother's wallpaper on the walls. Nobody took me. Nobody drugged me and nobody carried me. I walked in through the gate on my own 2 legs and asked for it. And what I did not expect, what nobody could have prepared me for, was that the girl everyone would call insane took one look at me and refused to install the lock. Let me back up, because the room is only half of it, and the half nobody expects is what she did after I moved in. My name is Callum Reed. At 24 I was carrying a delivery route in the mornings, a stock shift at a grocery in the afternoons, and 3 nights a week I washed dishes at a noodle place on Fenwick Street where the owner paid in cash and rounded down. Added up and it came to a life. Barely. The kind of life where you can name every hour of the coming week and not one of those hours belongs to you. My mother died when I was 19. She left 2 things behind. One was a sister, Junie, who was 11 at the time and is 16 now. The other was a stack of medical debt with my name on the guarantor line, because when you are 19 and someone hands you a clipboard in a hospital corridor, you sign whatever is on it. Junie lived with our aunt out in Holloway, which was 2 buses and an hour and 10 minutes away, and I paid for that arrangement in monthly installments the way a person pays for a car. I saw her most Sundays. Some Sundays I fell asleep on the second bus and rode it to the terminus and back and never got there at all. There was a man named Mr. Bright who called me every 9 days from a collections office. He was unfailingly polite. He always opened with, "Good afternoon, Mr. Reed, is now a convenient time," and I always said yes, because I had learned that saying no just moves the same conversation to a worse hour. The thing about that kind of tired is that it does not feel like drama. It feels like weather. It runs all day and you stop hearing it. And then one afternoon in the grocery I fell asleep standing up. I was holding a crate of romaine at the time. I did not drop it. I came back to myself maybe 4 seconds later, still upright, still holding the crate, with my supervisor 12 feet away not looking at me and nothing at all in my head. 4 seconds of pure nothing. What got me was not the 4 seconds. It was that when I tried afterward to remember the previous 4 days, I could not do it. Not the shifts, not the buses, not what I ate. There was a smear where a week should have been. My guy had been alive for 96 hours and had not been present for any of it. That night Junie called me 11 times. Her school had sent something home about a fee for a trip and our aunt had said no, and Junie wanted me to say yes, and I could not say yes, and I could not say no either, and so I let it ring while I stood in the alley behind the noodle place with my hands in a sink of gray water. At 8 minutes past midnight Mr. Bright called from a second number to inform me that my file had been escalated. He was very sorry to be calling at that hour. He asked if now was a convenient time. I stood in that alley and thought a thought I had never allowed myself before. I thought, I do not want to die, and I do not want to be rescued, and I do not want a raise. I want somebody else to hold all of this and never give it back. Which brings me to Wren Halvard. The Halvard family moves cold food. If you have eaten anything in this city that was ever below 4 degrees, some part of it rode in one of their trailers. They are not glamorous. They own depots and refrigeration units and a fleet of white trucks with a green stripe, and the whole operation runs out of a series of enormous gray buildings that nobody looks at twice. Wren was the only child of the 2nd generation, 23 years old, and she had been following me since the previous winter. People hear the word following and imagine something furtive. Wren was not furtive. Wren was consistent. He kept 11 meters. Always. I measured it once, out of curiosity, against the parking bays behind the grocery, and it was 11 meters at the grocery, 11 meters on Fenwick Street, 11 meters at the bus stop on Ardley where I waited at 4:40 in the morning. She stood there in a work jacket with the depot name on the shoulder, and she did not approach, and she did not hide, and when I turned around she looked back at me steadily the way you look at a stove you have left on. I never called the police, and I never crossed those 11 meters either, and I have thought about why. The honest answer is that a girl standing at a fixed distance in the dark was the least urgent problem I had that year. 6 weeks before that night in the alley, she broke pattern. I was at the Ardley stop, 4:40 in the morning, and she crossed the 11 meters and stood beside me and said, "I built a room for you." I said, "Excuse me." She said, "At the Merrow Lane Depot. Aisle 11. It is finished. It has been finished since August. I am not going to use it and I am not going to ask you to see it. I decided you should know that it exists, because you should know what a person near you is capable of. Then she went back to 11 meters and stood there until my bus came. That is the whole conversation. She did not smile, she did not cry, she did not apologize. She informed me of a hazard the way you would post a sign on a wet floor. Here is what I understood about Wren Halvard that most people did not. She did not lie. Not ever, not once, not to me and not to anybody else, until 3 days in February that I will get to. She would withhold a thing forever, and she would do something terrible without blinking, but if you asked her a direct question she would answer it flatly and completely and then wait to see what you did with it. And the second thing I understood, which nobody else in the world knew, was that I had met her before. When I was 17 I worked one winter at a distribution center out on the Ring Road. Night shift, loading. In February an auditor came through, and somewhere in that shuffle a 16-year-old girl in a company jacket got shut inside a cold trailer at the far end of the yard and nobody came for her. Not for 4 hours. Because everyone who saw her assumed somebody else was responsible, and because she was the owner's daughter, and being the owner's daughter meant that as far as the entire yard was concerned, she was already taken care of. I found her because I heard the door. I got her out. Her lips had gone the color of skim milk and she could not work her fingers. I gave her half of a sandwich and then all of it, and I sat in the warm cab of a parked reefer with her for the rest of my shift, and when the supervisor came by at 5 I said the trailer door had jammed on me, which was a lie, and it saved him and his job. Before she left she said, "If you ever need anything." 16 years old, still shaking, absolutely serious, saying it to a boy she had known for 4 hours. I said thanks and forgot about it for 7 years, and I did not put the name to the girl at the bus stop until the 3rd or 4th week she was standing there, and by then I was too tired to do anything with it. So no. I did not go to the depot on Merrow Lane because a stranger had been staring at me. I went because I remembered exactly who she was and exactly what she had offered, and because I had finally reached the point in my life where I intended to collect. The depot is a long gray building set back behind a chain-link fence, with a row of loading docks down one side and a yard big enough to turn a full trailer. It was raining that Tuesday, the fine kind that does not fall so much as hang. I walked in through the personnel door at 7 in the evening and nobody stopped me. Found out in January why nobody stopped me. My name had been on the site access list since August, along with a photograph, under the heading of contractor. Inside it was cold, and enormous, and lit by high-sodium lamps that turn everything the color of weak tea, and the whole place hummed on one low note that gets into your teeth after about a minute. There were aisles of racking 4 levels high stacked with wrapped pallets. Forklifts moved down the far end like animals. A radio somewhere was calling out bay numbers. It smelled like cardboard and cold metal and, faintly, like oranges. I found her in the middle of it. She was sitting up in the seat of an electric forklift, backing a pallet of frozen produce off a trailer, and she was doing it beautifully. That is not a word people use about warehouse work, but there is no other one. She took a 2-ton pallet off a lip and set it on a scale without a sound. She saw me and the machine stopped dead. She sat there with both hands still on the controls, and for a second she looked exactly like she had at 16 in that trailer, like someone waiting to find out whether a door was going to open or not. Then she got down and crossed the floor, and she did not stop at 11 meters. She stopped at about 2, which for her was an act of enormous violence. She said, "Are you hurt?" I said no. She said, "Is your sister hurt?" I said no. She said, "Then something is wrong, because you have not slept and you came here, and you have never come here." I said, "I want to take you up on the room." The hum of the building went on. A forklift beeped somewhere behind her. Wren Halvard stood in front of me in a company jacket with her hair pushed under a knit cap and looked at me with absolutely no expression at all, and then something happened to her face that I can only describe as a building losing power 1 floor at a time. She said, "Say the sentence again." So I said it properly. I said, "I am done. I have been done for about 3 years and I only noticed on Thursday. I want to move into the room you built. I want you to take my phone and my jobs and my debt and my sister's school fees and the bus schedule and all of it, and I do not want any of it back. I want you to keep me. Completely. That is the word I want you to hear. Completely." And Wren Halvard, 23 years old, heir to a cold chain empire, the most frightening person I have ever met, opened her mouth and said, "We have 412 cases of chicken on dock 2. I said, "What?" She said, 412. They are going out at 9. The temperature has to hold at -18. There is a driver named Paris and he is late, and if he is more than 40 minutes late I have to call the client. I realized, standing there in the cold, that she was not ignoring me. She had gone somewhere. Her hands had started to shake and her voice had gone completely flat, and she was reciting inventory, because inventory was the only thing in her head that would still hold still. I said, Wren. She said, 60 pallets of citrus in aisle 4, one of them is short-wrapped and I have not fixed it. I said, Wren. Breathe. She stopped. She looked down at her own hands like they belonged to a coworker. She said, in a very small voice, I have imagined this conversation approximately 900 times and in none of them did you ask. Then she said, come with me. Aisle 11 is at the back of the depot on the north wall, behind a set of heavy plastic strip curtains, in a bay that used to hold overflow racking. She pulled the curtain aside and the first thing I felt was warmth. The rest of the building runs at 4 degrees. That bay ran at 21, on its own separate unit, and stepping through the plastic was like walking out of one season into another. And sitting inside that bay, freestanding, with 4 feet of clearance all around it, was an apartment. Not a room. An apartment. Someone had built a complete 2-room dwelling in the middle of a warehouse the way they build display homes in a furniture showroom, with real walls and a real door and a real floor, and it was finished down to a coat hook. I walked around the outside of it first. It had a front door with a number on it. It had a window on the long side, and the window had a view, and the view was a photograph of a street lit from behind, and the light behind that photograph got dimmer over the course of the evening. Inside there was a kitchen with a working stove, a bathroom with hot water, a table, 2 chairs, a couch, a bed, and shelves with actual books on them that were actual books I had actually mentioned liking. I stood in the middle of that room and turned around slowly, and somewhere around the second turn I stopped, because I had recognized the wallpaper. It was a pale green with a repeating pattern of very small birds. My mother had hung that pattern in the apartment we lived in on Cordell Street when I was 15, in the good years, before everything else. I said, where did you get this? Wren said, the building on Cordell was gutted in the spring of last year. The contractor sold the fixtures. I bought the interior doors, the light switch plates, 4 rolls of the paper from the storage room, and the kitchen window latch. The stove is not the same stove. Yours was recalled. I said, that is the single most alarming sentence anyone has ever said to me. She said, I know. I considered lying and saying I found it at a market. I decided you would rather have the true version. And she was right. That is the thing. She was right. I was not confused about what this was. A person had spent a year of her life and a serious amount of money building a beautiful cage with my childhood wallpaper in it. No version of that is healthy. I knew it standing there and I know it now. I simply did not care. That is what being that tired does to a man. It burns off the part of you that weighs things. So I sat down at the table in the middle of the cage and I laid out my terms, out loud, because I was not about to write anything down ever again as long as I lived. I said, 1. Nothing is my problem anymore. Not the debt, not the aunt, not Junie's fees, not the noodle place. If it has my name on it, it is yours now. She said, agreed. I said, 2. You never ask me to decide anything. Not what to eat, not what to wear, not what day it is. If a question has 2 answers, do not bring it to me. Wren went very still at that 1. She said, agreed, but slower. I said, 3. You keep me as long as you want. There is no schedule. I am not visiting. I am not resting up. I am moving in and I am staying and the front door gets a lock, and you hold the key. And she said, no. I honestly thought I had misheard the woman. I said, no. She said, no lock. There is no lock on that door and there is not going to be one. It closes and it latches and it opens from both sides forever. I said, Wren, you built a confinement room. She said, I built a room. I built it for the version of this where you were unwilling. I have had 11 months to look at that version and I am not doing it. I said, I am giving you permission. And that is the first time I ever saw Wren Halvard angry. It did not look like anger. Her voice did not rise. She put one hand flat on the table and leaned in and said, if I take that, then in 6 months when you want to leave you will have to ask me. And I will have to be the kind of person who decides. And I am already, on my best day, 20 minutes away from being that person. So no. We looked at each other across the table for a while. Then she said, the door stays open. Everything else on your list, you get. All of it. More than you asked for. And she said the sentence that would run through the next 4 months of my life like a wire through a wall. She said, name it and it is yours. I said, fine. No lock. I lay down on the bed in the middle of a refrigerated warehouse at 8:10 in the evening, in a room papered with birds from an apartment that no longer existed, and I slept for 19 hours. She sat outside the plastic curtain the entire time. Not inside. Outside, on an upturned crate, in the cold, with a tablet on her knee, running a national distribution network for a shift and a half without moving more than 3 meters from that curtain. I know that because a forklift driver named Merrick told me in the spring, and Merrick is not a man who embroiders. He mentioned it once and never again, in the middle of a complaint about a broken pallet truck, and then he went back to complaining about the pallet truck. I woke up at 3 in the afternoon on a Wednesday and for about 90 seconds I did not know what year it was. The window said early evening. That was the first thing that got me. The photograph behind the glass was doing its slow amber fade, the one it did between 6 and 7, and my body believed it completely. Found out later that Wren had left the window on a normal cycle rather than adjusting it to my sleep, because adjusting it would have been managing what I saw, and she had drawn a line about that somewhere in her own head that she never explained to me. The second thing that got me was the smell of eggs. There was a plate on the table with breakfast on it, at 3 in the afternoon, and a note beside it that said, "Eat this one." Not a menu, not a choice of 2. 1 plate, 1 instruction. She had heard my second term and she had heard it exactly. I ate the eggs standing up. You pick that habit up from working. Then I sat down on the couch and waited to feel something. Guilt, probably. Panic. The little electric jolt that used to hit me every morning around 4 when the alarm went and my whole day came online at once. Nothing came. My phone was gone. My route was gone. There was no shift, and there was no bus, and there was no clipboard, and no part of the world was currently waiting on me for anything at all. I sat on that couch for 2 hours and did not move, and the only thought I had in all the time was that the couch was the correct firmness, which meant she had known that about me too. Around 5 o'clock the strip curtain rattled and Wren came in carrying a folding chair, which she set down 4 feet inside the door, and then she sat on it and looked at the wall. I said, "You can sit on the couch." She said, "I will work up to it." That was our first full day. She sat on a folding chair by the door for 3 hours, doing dispatch on a tablet, occasionally saying a number out loud to somebody through an earpiece, and I lay on a couch that fit me perfectly and stared at a photograph of a street. At some point I said, "This is insane." She said, "Yes." I said, "You know that." She said, "I have known it for 11 months. Knowing it did not help. Then she went back to her tablet and said, "Tell me a food you like." I said, off the top of my head, the shrimp instant noodles they sell at the corner place on Fenwick. The ones in the yellow packet. I ate about 400 of those in my 20s. The next morning there was a pallet. Understand the scale here. When I say pallet, people picture a crate. A standard pallet of instant noodles, stretch-wrapped, is chest-high and roughly the size of a kitchen island, and it contains something in the region of 900 packets. It was standing outside my front door at 7 in the morning with a delivery ticket taped to the film. Wren was next to it, holding a box cutter, entirely unembarrassed. I said, "Wren." She said, "That is the yellow packet." I said, "That is 900 yellow packets." She said, 960. It is a full layer count. Breaking a pallet down means it goes back on the floor as loose stock and loose stock gets miscounted. I did not want your noodles to get miscounted, and she said it so reasonably. That is the part one have never been able to convey to anyone. She did not say it like a joke and she did not say it like a threat. She said it like a woman explaining why the shelf is where it is. I laughed until I had to sit down on the step. It was the first time I had laughed in months and it came out of me wrong, like something breaking loose in a pipe. And watched me do it with an expression I could not read, and then she said, quietly, "Do that again." I said, "Do what?" She said, "Nothing. Eat your noodles." The pallet stayed. There was nowhere to put it, so she had it set against the north side of the apartment, flush to the wall, and I thought that was the end of the matter. It was not the end of the matter. The week after that I mentioned socks. Not a brand. Just socks, in the abstract, as a category. What arrived was 1,800 pairs sorted by size, with mine on the top layer where I could reach them without a stepladder. The one that finished me was the books. I said I had never gotten around to a particular author, and the next day there was a pallet of that author, every title, multiple copies, because the wholesaler would not break a case. There were 9 copies of the same paperback. Wren stood next to it with the delivery ticket and said, "You can give the extra ones away. That is a normal thing that people do." There was no joke anywhere in her face. Over the next 6 weeks I said the names of 12 other things I liked, at various moments, in a completely ordinary way, and every one of them arrived on its own pallet, and every pallet went up against the outside of the little house. And by the middle of December I was living inside a building that had a second building around it made of the things I had mentioned. That is what I mean when I say Wren provided. Nobody provides like that. Nobody sane. The jobs went first. She did not call my employers, because a phone call from an unknown woman would have gotten me fired in a way that followed me. She drove to each one in person, in the middle of a working day, in a company jacket. At the grocery she asked to speak to the store manager and told him, without preamble, that I was taking an extended leave and that Halvard would be covering the store's shortfall on temporary staffing costs for the duration. Then she asked him a question about his cold cabinet run times, and by the end of it the men had agreed to a service review and had forgotten to be annoyed about me. The noodle place on Fenwick, Mr. Sabo, who is 70 and has never once been intimidated by anything, told her that he did not take charity and that I had left him short on a Thursday. So Wren stood at his counter for 2 hours and washed his dishes herself. She is not squeamish and she is very fast. Then she left and came back the next Thursday and did it again. She did that for 5 weeks. Mr. Sabo told me afterward that he never worked out what she wanted, that she never asked him for anything, and that the pans had never been cleaner. Then came Mr. Bright. His call landed on a Tuesday morning on the phone she had taken off me, which she carried in her jacket like an organ transplant. She had my permission to answer everything. She put it on speaker on the table without being asked, which I appreciated, because she could have hidden the whole thing and I would never have known. Good afternoon, Mr. Reed. Is now a convenient time? Wren said, This is not Mr. Reed. My name is Wren Halvard. I am handling his obligations. Please continue. There was a pause on the line. Mr. Bright, who had spent 3 years being unfailingly polite to a man too tired to fight him, said, Are you a legal representative? She said, No. I am a private party. Give me the payoff figure. He gave it. And then came the part one had not braced for, the part that hurt more than anything else that winter. The number, said out loud by another person, in a warm room, was small. It was a number a person could carry. It had been carrying me for 5 years. It had eaten the part of my life between 19 and 24 and I had come to think of it as a weather system, and when Mr. Bright read it out I heard it for what it was, which was a figure. Just a figure. It fit in one breath. Wren said, I will settle it in full today. I want the account closed and I want written confirmation to the guarantor, and I want you to stop calling him. Mr. Bright said something about procedure. Wren said, Mr. Bright. You have called this man every 9 days for 3 years, and every time you have opened by asking whether it is a convenient time, and every time he has said yes, and it has never once been convenient. Today it is convenient. Close the account. It took her 2 more calls that afternoon, a transfer and a scan of something with her signature on it, and by 5 o'clock a 5-year-old account with my name on it did not exist. Then she put the phone face down on the table and said, without looking at me, Do you want the rest of the day alone? I said yes. She left. I sat in a room made of my childhood wallpaper surrounded by a wall of noodles and cried like an idiot for about 40 minutes, and then I was fine, and then I was not fine for about a week, and then I was genuinely fine. Junie was harder. My sister is 16 and has our mother's face and a mouth on her that could take paint off a truck. She called on the second Sunday, and Wren answered, because Wren answered everything now. Junie said, Who is this? Wren said, Wren Halvard. Your brother is asleep. He is well. He has eaten. He is not in danger and he is not in custody and he is not on anything. Junie said, Put him on. Wren said, He asked me to take his calls. Junie said, That is not an answer, that is a policy. 16 years old. I heard the whole thing from the doorway and I wanted on the record that my sister ran rings around a woman who negotiates with national grocery chains for a living. Wren said, Correct. It is a policy. Would you like to hear the reasoning behind it? Junie said, No. I would like to hear my brother's voice, and then I would like his address, and then I would like to know why a stranger is doing his talking. So Wren handed me the phone. She did not argue and she did not stall, and that is worth noting, because if she had wanted to she could have handled Junie the way she handled a late driver, and my sister would never have known she had been handled. I talked to Junie for an hour and told her a version of the truth. I had stopped working, I was staying with somebody who could look after me, the debt was gone, and her school fees were paid to the end of the year. Junie said, Paid by who? I said, By her. Junie said, Callum, that is not a favor, that is a purchase. I said, Junie, I am so tired. My 16-year-old sister went quiet on the phone for a long moment and then said, in a completely different voice, okay. Okay. Fine. I am coming to see you though. I said, sure. Sometime. I did not mean sometime. I meant no. It is very easy to say sure, sometime, when a couch is the correct firmness and somebody else is carrying your telephone around in her jacket. The last thing that happened to me before Christmas was Odile, and Odile was the first person from outside the arrangement to walk in and look at it. Wren Halvard is Wren's aunt and she runs operations for the whole eastern region, which means she runs the actual company while Wren's mother runs the family. She is 50-something, wears a coat indoors, and speaks the way a person reads out serial numbers. She came through the strip curtain on a Thursday without knocking, took in the entire situation in about 4 seconds, and said, so this is where the 21-degree unit went. I stood up. I was wearing a bathrobe. It was 2 in the afternoon. She said, sit down, you will hurt yourself. Then she walked a full circuit of my house inside a house, tapped one of the exterior walls, looked at the pallet stack, and said, is that citrus against a residential wall? I said, no, that one is the noodles. She said, thank God. Then she sat down in Wren's folding chair and got out a small notebook, and I braced myself for a speech. I had the speech ready in my head. Run while you still can, you have no idea what she is. She did not say any of that. Wren Halvard did not care about my soul at all. What she said was, Marrow Lane runs at 14% under capacity and has done for 2 years. Board is going to sell it. Probably in the spring, possibly sooner, and when it goes, that bay goes with it, along with the bit of concrete you are currently standing on. My niece knows this and has not told you. I said, why are you telling me this? Odile said, because you are the only variable in this depot I cannot forecast, and I would rather have you informed than surprised. Surprised people do expensive things. Then she wrote something in her notebook, stood up, and paused at the curtain. She said, one more thing. Everyone is going to tell you that she is the problem here. I am not going to tell you that. I have known Wren since she was born and she has never once broken a promise or told a lie, and I would put her on any dock in this country with $1 million of stock and never check. She is the most reliable human being I have ever met. I said, but. Odile said, but she has never in her life been on the other side of that. Not once. She provisions. It is the only verb she has, and you have just handed her a person to point it at with no ceiling and no end date, and I have no idea what that does to somebody, and neither does she. Then she left, and the plastic strip swung and settled, and I stood in my bathrobe in the middle of my beautiful room and I thought about that for a good 10 seconds before deciding it was not my problem, because nothing was my problem, because that had been the entire point. That was day 19. On day 19 I did the arithmetic and worked out that I had not been outside the building since the Tuesday I walked in. Not the yard. Not the fence. 19 days under sodium light and a photograph of a street. I checked myself for a reaction, the way you press a bruise. There was nothing there. I should tell you about the good part, because there was a good part, and if I skip it none of what comes after will make any sense. December in aisle 11 was the happiest I have ever been in my life. The building runs 3 shifts, so it never fully sleeps, and after a while I stopped hearing the hum the way you stop hearing a river. What I did hear was the pattern. Trailers backed onto the docks at 4:30 in the morning. The night crew handed over at 6 with a lot of shouting. There was a man on the day shift who whistled the same 8 notes of the same song for 8 hours and never once got to the 9th. Wren moved from the folding chair to the arm of the couch on the 11th day, and from the arm of the couch to the actual couch on the 19th, and each move took her about a week of visible preparation. She would come in at 7 in the evening with her jacket smelling of cold and diesel and sit at the far end with her boots off and her tablet on her knee, and run the eastern region from my living room while I read, and around 10 she would put the tablet face down and we would talk until midnight. She was funny. I did not expect that. Nobody who has met Wren Halvard expects that, because her face does not participate. But she had 11 months of observations about my life stored up with nowhere to put them, and once she started letting them out, she was merciless. She told me that the men at the corner shop on Fenwick had been overcharging me for 2 years, by a small amount, deliberately, and that she knew this because she had bought the same items on the same days for 4 months to build a comparison. She said it in the tone of a woman filing a report. I said, why did you never tell me? She said, you liked him. I laughed. Then I asked the follow-up question, because I am an idiot. I said, so what did you do about it? Wren put the tablet down. She said, I priced his lease. It runs out in March. The building belongs to a family who owe our northern depot a favor, and if I asked in January he would be gone by summer and would never find out why. The hum of the building went on somewhere above us. I said, and? She said, I kept the landlord's number in my phone for 22 days. Then I deleted it, because you buy your coffee in there on Tuesdays and you smile at him, and I could not work out how to take his shop away and still have the Tuesdays. Then she picked the tablet back up and said, I want you to know I did not delete it because it would have been wrong. I deleted it because of the Tuesdays. I am telling you that so you do not give me credit I have not earned. There is Wren Halvard entire, in one exchange, 3 months before anybody stopped a truck, and I sat on that couch and heard all of it and went back to my book. Then she carried on with the observations as though the last 4 minutes had not occurred. She told me that the bus I took at 4:40 in the morning was consistently 7 minutes late on Tuesdays because of a school route conflict on Ardley, and that if I had walked one stop further to Kell Street I would have gained 20 minutes of sleep a week for 2 years. She had worked this out in her first month of following me and had never said a word, because saying a word would have meant admitting she was there. I said, so you watched me lose 20 minutes a week for 2 years? She said, 104 hours in total. Yes. She looked genuinely pained. She said, it was the worst thing I did. Around the middle of the month I asked her the question that had been sitting in me since the wallpaper. I said, what do you actually know about me? Not the general stuff. All of it. She put the tablet down. She said, are you sure? I said yes, because I was 24 and comfortable and stupid. She did not get a notebook. She did not open a file. She sat on my couch with her hands in her lap and recited 11 months of my life from memory in a flat, even voice, for a little over 40 minutes. She knew my shift patterns and the 3 variations in my route. She knew that I ate on Tuesdays at the noodle place and skipped lunch on Fridays because Friday was the day the debt payment cleared. She knew the day in March I had sat down on a bench outside the depot on Kell Street and not gotten up for an hour and a half. She said, you were not on the phone and you were not eating. I have wondered about that hour for 9 months. I remembered it. It was the day Junie's aunt had told me the arrangement might have to change. She knew the exact date my mother died, and she knew what I did on the anniversary, which was nothing, which was the whole problem. And then she said, you talk to yourself when you are carrying something heavy. You say, all right. Just that. All right, all right, all right, until it is where it needs to go. You have done it every single time I have watched you lift anything, for 11 months, and I do not think you know you do it. I did not know I did it. I have caught myself doing it maybe 200 times since. I said, Wren, that is a year of your life. She said, yes. I said, doing what, exactly? Standing in the cold. She said, mostly. Twice I sat in a car. Once I stood in a doorway for 6 hours in the rain because you had a shift change and I did not know which door you would use. I said, why not just talk to me? And Wren Halvard looked at the wallpaper with the little green birds on it and said, because the version where I talk to you is a version where you can say no. And I did not have a plan for that. I had a plan for every other thing. Christmas came and went. She brought a tree. It was a real one, 4 feet tall, in a bucket of sand, and she brought it in on the tines of a forklift because that was faster than carrying it, which is possibly the most Wren Halvard sequence of events I can describe. She cooked dinner herself in the little kitchen with the wrong stove, badly, and refused to let anyone else touch any part of it. The potatoes were an atrocity. She watched me eat every mouthful with the fixed attention of a woman watching a load test. Afterward she fell asleep on the couch at 9:30 in the evening, sitting upright, mid-sentence, and I sat there and looked at her. That was the first time I understood that she had not slept properly in about a year either. And this is where it starts to go wrong, and it goes wrong so gently that neither of us saw it for weeks, so I will lay it out the way it actually happened, in order, without flattering myself. Week 1, I stopped setting an alarm. Reasonable. There was nothing to be on time for. Week 3, I stopped wearing shoes, because the whole world I used was 40 steps across. Week 5, I stopped knowing what day it was. Not in a poetic way. I mean that if you had woken me and asked, I would have had to think about it, and eventually I stopped bothering to think about it, and eventually she stopped mentioning it, because mentioning it was a piece of information that led to a decision, and she had agreed not to bring me those. Week 7, I stopped finishing books. I would ask her to pick one and she would pick one and I would read 6 pages and put it down. Then I stopped opening them. Week 9, I stopped asking for things. That is the one that did it. The load-bearing wall coming out. Because in the beginning, the game between us had been that I would mention a thing and it would arrive on a pallet, and there was a whole comedy in that, and we both enjoyed it. She enjoyed it more than anything else in her life. I have never seen a person light up the way Wren Halvard lit up when I said the word coffee in a certain tone. But after 9 weeks of everything arriving, wanting stopped working. It is very hard to explain. Wanting is a muscle you use by not immediately getting. When every gap between the wanting and the having closes to zero, the whole apparatus goes slack and falls off, like a limb in a cast. So she would ask, "What do you feel like eating?" And I would say, "You pick." She would say, "There is a market in the yard on Fridays, the driver set it up, do you want to walk down?" And I would say, "You pick." She would say, "I have 2 hours free on Sunday, we could do anything. You pick." I said those 2 words to that woman, by her own count, 431 times in 11 weeks. She kept the count. Of course she kept the count. She counts everything. She counted this and said nothing about it for a long, long time. What she did instead was start testing me, and I did not notice a single one of the tests until she told me about them afterward. The first test was small. She came in one evening and said, "The citrus contract went to Bellamy, not to Ross." I had been listening to her talk about that account for a month. Ross had it. She had told me on 3 separate nights that Ross had it. I said, "That is great." She said nothing. The second test was 2 weeks later. She said, "My mother is coming in on Thursday." Wren's mother had been in Lisbon since October and Wren had told me twice that week that she would not be back until spring. I said, "Okay." She said, "Does that worry you?" I said, "Whatever you think." The third test was on a Tuesday in February and I still cannot think about it without my ears going hot. She sat down at the table across from me. She waited until I looked up. And she said, in a completely level voice, "Your mother's name was Marianne." My mother's name was Adele. Wren had known that for 11 months. She had known it before I ever spoke to her. She had bought 4 rolls of wallpaper out of a gutted building because of that woman. And I looked across a table at a person who had said my dead mother's name wrong, and I said, "Sure." And then I went back to looking at the window. There was a sound. I looked up. Wren had picked up her water glass and put it down again on the table so hard that the base cracked, and she was sitting there with her hand still around it and water going everywhere, and she was staring at me with an expression I had never seen on her before and have only seen twice since. She said, "Say her name." I said, "What?" She said, "Say your mother's name, Callum." And I could not work out why she was upset, which tells you everything about the state I was in. I said, "Adele." Obviously. Adele. "What is wrong with you?" She said, "I have told you 3 things in 5 weeks that were not true. The citrus went to Ross. My mother is still in Lisbon. Your mother's name is Adele. You have corrected me 0 times." She said, "Those are the only 3 lies I have told anybody in my life, and I told them on purpose, to find out whether you were still in there. And now I know, and I would like them back, and I cannot have them back." She stood up. Water was running off the table onto the floor, and she did not do anything about it, and if you knew her you would understand that Wren Halvard leaving a spill on a floor is a bigger event than most people's divorce. She said, "You have not made a decision in 11 days. I said, "That was the deal." She said, "I know it was the deal." I said, "Term 2. No questions with 2 answers. You agreed." She said, "I know I agreed." I said, "So what is the problem?" And Wren Halvard, standing in a spreading puddle in a fake apartment inside a refrigerated warehouse she had built with her own hands out of the ruins of my childhood, said the sentence that broke the entire arrangement in half. She said, "The problem is that I have been in love for 11 months with a man who carried 4 impossible things at once and cracked a joke at 4:40 in the morning at a bus stop. And I have spent 11 weeks taking those 4 things off him one at a time, and what is sitting on that couch is not him. I have unloaded you." And something went out with the load. I said, "I am happier than I have ever been." She said, "I believe you. That is what frightens me." And she left, and she did not come back for 2 days, and on the 3rd day she came in and sat on the folding chair by the door instead of the couch, which she had not done since November, and she told me about the trailer. I had never asked her about it. I had assumed I knew the story, because I had been in it. She said, "You think what happened to me in that trailer was the cold?" I said, 4 hours at -20, at 16 years old. Yes. She said, "No. The cold was not interesting. I have been cold my whole life, my family sells cold." She said, "Do you know what happened after you went home?" I said no. She said, "I got a ride back to the house. I let myself in. It was 5:20 in the morning. My mother was on a call in the kitchen with Rotterdam. She saw me come in and she raised one finger, like this, meaning wait, and she finished the call, and the call took 9 minutes. She said, and then she asked me if I had eaten. She said, I had been missing for 4 hours in a freezing box on the far side of a yard, and my own house did not know. Nobody had called anybody. Nobody had counted heads. My name did not come up all night, in any room, anywhere on that property. She said, and 4 hours earlier a 17-year-old had heard a door and stopped what he was doing and stayed with me until his shift ended, and then lied to his supervisor to protect a man he barely knew. She said, I did not fall in love with you at 16. That is a story people tell, and it is a stupid story. What happened at 16 is that I found out the difference between being provided for and being noticed, and then I spent 8 years being extremely good at the first one, because it turns out I am not able to do the second one at all. She said, so I built you a room where every single thing would be handled. And I got exactly what I asked for. And you are disappearing in it, and I have run out of things to bring you, and the only thing I have never once tried is the thing that actually worked in that trailer, which was doing nothing whatsoever except being there. I said, Wren. She said, I am going to make this worse before it gets better, and I want you to know that I know I am doing it. Then she got up and went out through the plastic curtain, and about 40 minutes later the temperature in aisle 11 began to drop. I woke at some hour in the dark and my nose hurt. Cold in a refrigerated building is not the cold you know. Outside, cold has a source. There is wind, there is a sky, there is somewhere else you could go. In there it has no direction at all. It does not gust and it does not ease, and after an hour you understand that the room is not on your side anymore. The unit above aisle 11 had gone from 21 degrees to something in the low 10s. Not dangerous. Nowhere near dangerous, and she had done the arithmetic on that, obviously she had. Just deeply, unmistakably unpleasant. I lay under the blanket for 40 minutes waiting for it to be fixed. That is genuinely what I did. I lay there in the dark and waited for the temperature to be handled, the way I had waited for everything to be handled for 11 weeks, and it did not get handled, and eventually I put my feet on the floor and the floor was so cold it made me swear. My boots were by the door. Set neatly, side by side, laces loosened, the way you set out boots for a person you expect to need them. On top of the left one was a folded piece of paper, and on the paper, in her small square handwriting, it said, heat runs 6 to 8 in the morning and 8 to 10 at night. Blankets are in the linen store off the corridor by Dock 4. Turn left at the yellow post. There is coffee in the crew room. It is bad. I stood in that fake little kitchen at 4 in the morning holding a note about blankets, and I have never in my life been so angry because I knew exactly what she was doing. That is the humiliating part. I understood the theory perfectly. She was making me walk. She was inserting a gap between the wanting and the having, a corridor's worth of gap, 300 meters and a turn at a yellow post, and she was doing it deliberately, in cold blood, because a man who will not choose his own dinner will still go and get a blanket if he is cold enough. And it worked. I got dressed and put on the boots and pushed through the strip curtain and walked out into a working warehouse at 4 in the morning for the first time in 103 days. I had forgotten how enormous it was. From inside the bay I had been living in a 40-foot world, and I came out into a building you could park a passenger ferry in, forklift beacons swinging orange across the racking, a man on a pallet truck shouting a bay number. Somebody yelled at me to get out of the traffic lane. Found the linen store. I got a blanket. I got 2. On the way back I stopped in the crew room and drank the coffee, which was, as advertised, bad, and I stood there holding a paper cup in a room with 3 drivers who did not know who I was and did not care. And one of them said something about the weather, and I said something back, and it was the first conversation I had had with a stranger since November. I got back to aisle 11 at 10 past 5 in the morning with 2 blankets and a paper cup and my heart going like a bird, and I was furious, and I was awake, and I had not been awake in a very long time. Wren was sitting on the crate outside the curtain. I said, you broke the deal. She said, yes. I said, term 1. Nothing is my problem. Term 2, no decisions. She said, I know the terms. I agreed to them in November and I am breaking both of them starting today, and I am telling you to your face instead of doing it quietly. That is the most decent version of this I have available. I said, you cannot just decide that I need to suffer a bit for my own good, Wren, that is the oldest trick there is. And she said, I am not making you suffer. I am giving you your things back. That is a different sentence. Then she took my phone out of her jacket and held it out. I looked at that phone the way you look at a wasp. I had not held it since the first week of November. 3 months of my life had been handled through that rectangle by somebody else, and I had loved every second of it, and she was holding it out flat on her palm like a woman returning a set of keys. I said, "I do not want it." She said, "I know. Take it anyway." I took it. It had been charged. It was up to date. She had never once deleted a message, and she told me so before I asked, because of course she did. There were 409 messages from my sister. I sat down on the crate next to her in the cold with the phone in my hands, and I did not open a single one of them, and Wren did not say anything at all, and we watched the 6 o'clock shift change from the outside of the curtain like two people watching weather. The job started on the Monday. She did it the only way she could have done it and had it mean anything, which was that she did not do it. She gave my name to the shift office as a temporary hire on the standard rate, and then she stayed completely out of it, and the man who got handed my file was Merrick Soa, night supervisor, 22 years on that floor, a man built like a bollard with opinions to match. Merrick did not know who I was. That was the entire point, and it was the best gift she ever gave me, and she gave it by giving me nothing. He looked at my hands on the first night and said, "Office." I said, "No." He said, "Hands say office." Then he put me on the pick line with a scanner and a cage and told me the rate was 92 lines an hour and that nobody hits 92 on their first night and that he would be pleased with 60. I did 31. My back gave out at hour 4. My hands, which had spent 3 months not doing anything harder than opening a book I was not going to finish, were shaking on the scanner by 2 in the morning, and I dropped a case of frozen peas and split it. And 800 peas went across a traffic lane, and Merrick stood over me while I picked them up one at a time and said absolutely nothing for 6 minutes, which is a supervisory technique I have never seen bettered. I came back the next night. That surprised him. It surprised me more. By the end of the second week I was at 64 lines. By the end of the fourth I was at 88, and Merrick told me, in the tone of a man handing down a knighthood, that my hands had stopped saying office. Being handed your life back in small pieces hurts like circulation returning. Every single thing that came back with a bill attached. I got my body back and it ached. I got my days back and they were structured and boring. I got my phone back and it contained 409 messages from a 16-year-old asking her brother where he was. And I got wanting back, and wanting is agony, it turns out. I had forgotten. The first thing I genuinely wanted, on my own, unprompted, was a specific sandwich from a specific place on Kell Street, and I did not tell Wren about it. And I walked out of the gate on my own 2 legs on a Thursday afternoon and bought it with money I had earned on a pick line, and it was the best thing I have ever eaten, and it cost $4.40, and I nearly cried in the street like a lunatic. I did not tell her that either. I want to say I did. I did not. What I did instead was fight with her, constantly, about everything, for about 6 weeks. We fought about the heating schedule. We fought about whether she was allowed to look at my shift record, which she was not, and did anyway, and admitted to immediately, because after February she never let herself do it again. Which meant our fights had a specific shape where she would confess before I accused and I would be left standing there holding an accusation with nowhere to put it. We fought about Merrick. She had, it turned out, told him nothing at all except my name and my start date, and I discovered this and got angry that she had not vouched for me, having spent the previous 2 weeks being angry that she might have. She pointed that out. Flatly. Standing in the kitchen at 10:30 at night. She said, "On the 4th you were angry that I might have spoken to Merrick. On the 11th you are angry that I did not. I am recording this so we can look at it later." I said, "Do not use that voice on me, I am not a driver who is late." She said, "Then stop running 2 contradictory routes." I threw a dish towel at her. An actual dish towel, like a child. It hit her in the chest and fell on the floor, and Wren Halvard looked down at it, and looked up at me, and her mouth did something it had never done before, which was curve. She said, "Do that again." I said, "Why does everything I do wrong make you happy?" She said, "Because the men on the couch did not throw anything." That was the winter. Fighting in a fake kitchen at 10:30 at night. Working a pick line under a man who thought I was nobody. Blankets from a linen store, 300 meters and a turn at a yellow post. 2 hours of heat in the morning and 2 at night, and Wren in a jacket on the crate outside the curtain, refusing to come in and warm herself up, because she had put herself on the same schedule as me and had not mentioned it once. I found that out from Merrick, obviously. Everything true I learned that year, I learned from Merrick. He said it in the crew room over the bad coffee, apropos of nothing. He said, "The Halvard girl sleeps in the shift office." I said, "Since when?" He said, "Since always." 2 hours, 3. On the chair, not the couch, because the couch means you meant to. 22 years I am here. Her mother used to do it. Her aunt does it. Whole family is like this, they think a building is a person and it will die if they look away. I said, does anybody make her stop? Eric gave me a long look over the top of a paper cup and said, who would do that? I did not have an answer for him, and I did not think about it again for 3 weeks. I would give a great deal to go back and change that, because the whole time I was being handed my life back, piece by piece, in the coldest and most deliberate act of love I have ever been on the receiving end of. It never crossed my mind even once to ask what any of it was costing her. I was 24. I was busy. I was finally, painfully, gloriously awake. And then in the 3rd week of March I took an overnight run to the Kell Street site without telling anybody, and my phone died, and Wren Halvard stopped 41 trucks. Here is how a completely ordinary decision turns into 41 stopped trucks. Merrick was short a body for an overnight at the Kell Street site. Kell Street is a smaller building on the other side of the river that handles chilled rather than frozen, and it is a 40-minute drive, and the crew there had 2 people out with the same flu. He asked the room. I put my hand up before I had finished thinking about it. That was the thing. That right there was the actual event of my whole winter, and it lasted about a second and a half. A man asked a room a question and my hand went up on its own, and I felt something in my chest go off like a starter motor. I did not tell Wren. I have gone over this 100 times and I will give you the honest accounting. 60% of it was that I genuinely forgot, because I left straight off the end of a shift and got in a van with 4 men and a box of donuts. 40% of it was that I did not want to ask, not because she would have said no. She would not have said no. She would have said, good, take a coat, and she would have meant it, and she would have gone and sat on the crate outside an empty room for 11 hours. Did not want to ask because asking would have made it hers. And I had exactly one thing in the world at that point that was mine, and it was a raised hand in a crew room. My phone died somewhere around midnight. The battery on that thing had been dying for 2 years and I had never replaced it, because for the previous 3 months I had not been carrying it, and before that I had not had the money. At 5:20 in the morning I came out of the personnel door at Kell Street into a wet gray dawn, and the yard was full of trucks. Not moving. Standing. Parked in rows with their engines off, which is a thing you never see, because a reefer with its engine off is a clock running down on somebody's stock. There were drivers standing around in the drizzle in high-visibility coats, 12 or 15 of them that I could see, and none of them were loading anything. I walked into that yard and one of the drivers turned around and looked at me and then said, over his shoulder, in a completely flat voice, got him. And every single head in that yard turned at once. Wren was at the far end, walking down the line. She was in the same jacket she had been in when I left. Her hair was wet through and she was not carrying anything, and that is how I knew, because Wren Halvard always has the tablet, and she did not have the tablet. She came up the yard and stopped about 4 feet away and looked at me without saying anything at all, and it was the second time I ever saw that expression, the one from the night of the water glass. Then she said, 41. I said, what? She said, 41 trucks. 3 sites. The corridor hold went out at 1:50 in the morning and I lifted it 20 minutes ago. 2 of those loads are chilled dairy and will be short-dated when they land, and one is a pharmaceutical consignment that has a temperature log which now has a 4-hour gap in it that I am going to have to explain to a client on Monday. She said all of it in the same voice she used for bay numbers. Then she stopped, and something went out of her shoulders, and she said, in a different voice entirely, your phone was off. I said, the battery. She said, I know. I checked the tower data at 10 past midnight. It did not move and it did not power down cleanly, it just stopped, and a phone that stops is not the same as a phone that is switched off, and I could not get past that. I said, Wren, you stopped a national corridor because my battery died. She said, yes. I said, do you understand how that sounds? And she said, better than you do. I wrote the protocol I used. It is for contamination recall. I have run it twice in my life, both times for real, and this morning I ran it for a man who went to work. The rain came down on the 2 of us in that yard. Somewhere behind me an engine started and the whole line began to come back to life 1 truck at a time, and drivers who had been standing in the wet for 4 hours started climbing back into their cabs, and not one of them said a word to me, which was worse than if they had. And then Wren told me the rest, because she had used up her allowance of lying in February and had not liked the taste of it, and because she had clearly decided on the drive over that she was going to say the whole thing out loud in daylight. She said, at 3 in the morning I called a man named Pavel who does our gate systems. I said, okay. She said, I asked him what the lead time was on a controller swap at Marrow Lane. He said he could do it Sunday. I asked him whether the personnel doors could be set to a profile where they release from the yard side only. Rain kept going. I did not say anything. She said, he told me yes. He told me it would take him 2 hours and that it is a standard configuration for a bonded store. And I said, book it. And he said, book it for Sunday, and I said yes. She said, that call lasted 4 minutes. I sat in the car afterward for 9 minutes. Then I called him back and cancelled it, and I told him why, in detail, because I wanted somebody who was not me to know what I had nearly done. She said, I have not slept since Thursday. That is not an excuse, it is a data point. I want to be careful here, because this is the part where a story like this usually reassures you. It usually tells you that she was never really dangerous, that it was all longing and hurt underneath, that the frightening thing was a misunderstanding. That is not what happened. She was dangerous. On the 3rd week of March, at 3 in the morning, in a parked car, my life came within 9 minutes of having a door in it that only opened from the outside. And the only thing that stopped it was a woman sitting alone in the dark deciding, with no witnesses and no reward, to phone a man back. I stood in that yard and I was frightened of her for the first time. Properly frightened, in the flat animal way you are frightened of a large machine that has started moving on its own. And then I said the only thing I have ever said that I am completely proud of. I said, you do not get to do that. Not on your worst night. Not if I disappear for a week. Not ever. If the day comes when you cannot hold that on your own, you call me and you say the words out loud before you call Pavel. She said, and if you are the thing I cannot hold, I said, then you call Marek. Or Odile. Or my sister. You call somebody, Wren, because a person who only ever provides never gets to be caught, and you are going to fall eventually, and it is going to be from a great height. She looked at me in the rain in a yard full of restarting engines and she said, all right. Just that. All right. My own words, the ones she had listened to me say for 11 months while I lifted things. She gave them back to me in a car park with her hair soaked flat to her head, and I understood that she had been saving them. The bill came on Monday. Wren Halvard called me into the shift office at Marrow Lane, which she had commandeered, and she had the numbers already printed, because she is a woman who prints things. The corridor hold cost the company an amount of money I will not say out loud because it still makes me feel ill. The pharmaceutical client did not terminate, but they moved 60% of their volume in the second quarter, and that is worse, because losing a client in one piece is a story and losing them in slices is a trend. Deal said, I will not be shouting at you. I said, I would honestly prefer it. She said, I know. Then she put a single sheet of paper on the desk in front of me, face up, and I looked at it and it was an offer. It was a job in another region, a real one, at a real wage, with a start date in 3 weeks and relocation attached, and a line at the bottom about a transitional payment that was roughly 4 times what my mother's debt had been. She said, take it. Not as a bribe. Take it because it is a good job and you would be good at it, and because I have watched my niece since she was born and I am telling you that she cannot be the one to end this. She has never ended anything in her life. She holds. It is the only thing she does. I said, and what happens to her? Odile said, she will run the Eastern region very well for 40 years and sleep in the chair and never once be late, and she will be perfectly all right in the way that a load-bearing wall is perfectly all right. Did not say no. I want that on the record, because it does not flatter me and because everybody who tells this story afterward gets it wrong. I folded that piece of paper into my jacket and carried it around for 2 days. On the second night I got it out at the table in aisle 11 and put it down in front of Wren and watched her read it. She read it twice. Then she said, the wage is right for that region, the relocation is generous, and Osset is a good site with a decent manager who does not shout at people. She said, take it. I said, you do not mean that. She said, I mean every word of it and I would drive you to the station myself. She had both hands on the edge of the table by then and she was holding onto it hard enough to whiten the knuckles. She said, do not make me say it a 3rd time. So I went back to Odile in the morning and told her no, and Odile said, why not? And I said, because in December I could not have read that page at all. I would have said, you pick. Your niece has spent an entire winter turning me into a man who can say no to a piece of paper, and the first thing I spend that on is not going to be her. Wren Halvard put her pen down. She said, that is a much better answer than I expected, and it does not change anything about Marrow Lane. Then she told me the date. The depot had been listed. The sale was going through in the 2nd week of May. 9 weeks. She said, the racking gets stripped and the building goes to a parcel firm who will tear out the cold plant, because parcels do not need to be cold. The unit above aisle 11 gets scrapped. They get scrapped. Everything in it gets scrapped, including a 2-room dwelling with a photograph in the window, which as far as this company is concerned is an unlisted structure of no book value. She said, I am telling you first because you can tell her better than I can. I said, why would you think that? Odile said, because you are the only person on this property she has ever said a true thing to before she had to. I went back to aisle 11. I sat on the couch with the correct firmness in a room that had 9 weeks left, and I did not know how to start the sentence, and while I was sitting there working on it, the gate office called through to say that a 16-year-old girl was at the fence asking for me by name and refusing to leave. Junie was standing at the fence in her school coat with a backpack and an expression I recognized, because it was our mother's, and because I had seen it in a mirror. She had taken 2 buses and then a third one that she was not supposed to be able to afford, and she had been at that fence for an hour and 10 minutes before the gate office got around to calling anybody. I came out through the personnel door and she watched me walk the whole length of the yard and did not move a muscle. When I got there she said, you look fine. I said, Junie. She said, no, I mean it, you look great, you look rested, you have got a bit of color, that is fantastic. Then she hit me in the arm hard enough to leave a mark and said, 409 messages, Callum. I got her through the gate and I bought her a hot chocolate out of the machine in the crew room, which she drank while looking around at everything with the ferocious attention of a person collecting evidence. And I took her to aisle 11. I have thought a lot about whether that was a mistake. It was not. She was going to find out and it was going to be worse secondhand. But I did not brace her for it either, and I should have, because we came through the plastic curtain and she stopped dead in the entrance and made a sound I have never heard my sister make. There was a house. In a warehouse. Freestanding, with a door number, and a window with a photograph in it, and a wall of stretch-wrapped pallets stacked along the north side 4 high with my favorite things inside them. Junie said, what is this? I said, it is where I have been living. She walked around the outside of it the way Odile had, 1 full circuit, and she came back to the front and looked up at the roof and said, in a small voice, is it locked? I said, no. It has never been locked. There is no lock. She said, that is somehow worse. Then she went inside, and I heard her stop again, and when I came in after her she was standing in the middle of the living room with one hand flat on the wall. Little green birds. For rolls of it, salvaged out of a gutted building on Cordell Street. My sister was 8 years old when we left that apartment. She got years less of our mother than I did, and what she has she guards like a dragon, and one of the things she has is a wall. She said, without turning around, Callum, who did this? Wren came through the curtain about 90 seconds later, because of course she did, because a gate log had pinged an hour and a half earlier and she had spent that entire 90 minutes deciding whether coming in was the right thing or the selfish thing, and had eventually concluded that she did not get to hide from it. She stopped just inside the door. She said, my name is Wren Halvard. You are Junie. I have not met you and I have paid your school fee since November, and I understand that those 2 facts do not go together. My sister, 16 years old, in a school coat, in the middle of a fake apartment inside a refrigerated warehouse, turned around and took Wren Halvard apart. She said, you bought my brother. Wren said, that is a reasonable description. Junie said, no it is not reasonable, it is what happened, do not agree with me like a doctor. She said, do you know what I got in November? I got a phone call from a woman I had never met telling me he had eaten. That is what she said. He is well, he has eaten. Like a report on a dog. He said, I did not want a report. I wanted my brother on a bus on a Sunday, and I lost that in November, and you paid for a trip to a science museum instead, and I went on it, and it was great, and I hated every minute of it. She said, you outsourced me. He handed me over and you took the file and you have been running me ever since. I have been a line on somebody's list since I was 11 years old, and I did not mind so much when the person carrying the list was him, because at least he was tired about it. And I stood there in that room and said nothing at all, because there was nothing available to say. Wren took all of it. She did not explain herself, she did not bring up the money, and when Junie ran out of breath, Wren said, you are right, and it was not a rhetorical device, she meant it in the same way she means a temperature. Then she did something I had never seen her do. She said, Junie, I do not know how to fix this and I am not able to work it out on my own. Tell me what to do and I will do it. I need to explain what that cost her. Wren Halvard had never asked anyone for anything in her entire life. Not her mother, not her aunt, not a driver, not me. Asking is the opposite of providing. Asking means the other person can say no, and she had told me herself, on that couch in December, that she had no plan for no. She asked a 16-year-old in a school coat. Junie stood there with her hand still on the wallpaper and thought about it for a long time. She is not a cruel kid. She could have been, and she was entitled to be, and she was not. She said, "Give him back." She said, "Not to me. To himself. Give him back the way you found him, tired and broken on the 4:40 bus, because at least that man came to see me on Sundays." Then she looked around at the little house one more time and said, "And take this down. It is beautiful and it is a coffin and you know it, and if my mother saw her own wallpaper in here she would put her hand through a window." Wren said, "All right." She and Junie sat in the crew room for 2 hours after that, and I was not allowed in, and neither of them has ever told me one single word of what was said. I asked Junie about it years later and she said, "Family business," and would not budge. 2 nights after that I found out about the phone call with Lisbon. I was coming back from a shift at 4 in the morning and Wren was standing in the traffic lane by the Dock 4 door with her phone to her ear. And I heard the last 90 seconds of it because she did not walk away and she did not lower her voice, and afterward she told me the rest herself. She was asking her mother for money to buy the building, not a gift. A loan, at commercial rate, secured against her own equity, with a term and a schedule, drawn up properly, because Wren does not do anything sloppily even when she is begging. And I heard her say, "No, that is not what it is for." And then, after a pause, "No." And then, in a voice I had never heard her use, one that had a crack running through the middle of it, "I am asking you for one thing. In 23 years. I am asking for one." She listened for a while. Then she said, "Understood, and thank you for your time," and she hung up, and put the phone in her pocket, and stood in the traffic lane of a working warehouse at 4 in the morning with her arms at her sides. Wren Halvard was not shouting. I keep coming back to that. I could hear the tone through the phone from 8 feet away and it was pleasant, and warm, and completely immovable, and it belonged to a woman who genuinely loved her daughter and had raised her the way you raise an asset. Wren told me the substance afterward, all of it, no editing. Her mother had said that Marrow Lane was underperforming, which was true. That buying it personally would put every cent Wren had into a building she was keeping for sentimental reasons, which was true. That the whole business had already cost the company $1.25, which was true. And that she was saying no for Wren's own good, which was, in its own horrible way, also true. And then Wren Halvard had said one more thing, which Wren repeated to me flatly, standing in that traffic lane. She had said, "Darling, if you need him to be somewhere, buy him a house." Wren had crawled a very long way from that sentence to get to a kitchen where she could say, "Tell me what to do," to a 16-year-old in a school coat. 3 days later she asked me the question. We were sitting on the crate outside the curtain at the end of a night shift, and the 6 o'clock changeover was making its usual noise. She was holding a cup of the bad coffee that she never actually drank, and she said, without any preamble at all, "I have 9 weeks." I said, "I know." Odile told me. He said, "I could put it somewhere else. Not the building, the room. It is a modular structure, it comes apart in 9 sections, and I could have it standing in another bay at another site inside a month." Then she turned her head and looked at me and said, "If I did that, would you follow the room, or would you follow me?" And I hesitated. Not long. Half a second, maybe less. Half a second of a man's face doing arithmetic. I said, "You. Obviously you." And Wren Halvard smiled at me, which she almost never did, and said, "Thank you for not lying," which was somehow the cruelest sentence anyone has ever said to me, and it was not meant to be cruel at all. Then she said, "I have known since November that you came here for the room. You told me so on the first night. You said, 'I want to move into the room you built.' You never once said my name in that sentence." She said, "That was not a trap. I took the arrangement knowing exactly what it was, and I would take it again, and I have had a winter I did not think I would ever be allowed to have. But I will not spend the next 40 years being the price of a room." She stood up and dropped the untouched coffee in the bin. She said, "I am taking it down on Thursday." She did it herself, in one night, with 3 men and 2 forklifts, and I was not allowed to help. I stood by the yellow post at the end of the corridor and watched a woman dismantle 11 months of her own work in 6 hours, and she did it the same way she did everything, which was well. The pallet wall came down first, load by load, and each pallet went back into general stock with a scan, because loose stock gets miscounted. The wall panels came off in sections. The window went into a crate with foam corners, photograph and all. The stove she had bought because mine had been recalled came out on a pallet truck at 4 in the morning and went into a skip, because it was the wrong stove and she would not sell it to anybody. At about 5 she came out through what used to be the front door carrying a bundle wrapped in shrink film, and she walked down the corridor and put it in the back of a car. 4 rolls of green wallpaper with little birds. 2 interior doors. 6 light switch plates. One kitchen window latch. She drove it out to Holloway that Sunday and gave the whole lot to my sister, and said that they had never been hers to have, and that she was sorry it had taken her 11 months to work that out, and then she left before Junie could say anything back. Moved into an apartment on Ardley on the 1st of April. 1 room and a hot plate. She paid the first month. That was all. She had my new address, obviously, and I told her she was not to come to it, and she said, all right, and I said, I mean it, Wren, and she said, I know, all right. She stood on the sidewalk by the car and looked at the door of a building she was not going to enter. She said, you told me in the rain that a person who only ever provides never gets to be caught. I said, I remember. She said, I have been thinking about it since. I am going to stop now. Not because I want to, and not because it is noble, and I would like you to understand that I could pick this back up tomorrow and it would take me about 4 hours. She said, I am stopping because you asked me once to call somebody before I did the thing I cannot hold. And I have gone through everyone I know, and there is nobody to call about this, because the thing I cannot hold is you. She said, so I am calling myself. Out loud. In the street. Here it is. Then she got in the car and drove to work, because it was 6:20 in the morning and she was already late. The apartment on Ardley was 9 minutes walk from the bus stop where a girl in a work jacket once stood at 4:40 in the morning telling me she had built me a room. If you leaned out of the window and looked up you could see a strip of sky about as wide as your hand. I was very bad at living in it, not sad. I want to be accurate about this, because the version where the man goes back to his little apartment and is nobly miserable is a lie and I refuse to tell it. I was not miserable. I was incompetent. I had gone from a life where every hour was spoken for straight into a life where somebody else spoke for all of them, and then straight out into a life where nobody spoke for any of them at all, and I had skipped the part in between where an ordinary person learns to run a week. First Saturday I bought groceries. I stood in the aisle of the same store I had stocked shelves in for 2 years and I could not do it. I do not mean it was emotional. I mean I did not know what to buy. Having any relationship at all with your own appetite 3 days from now is a skill, and mine had been switched off since November. I came out with 7 items and 5 of them were bread. That night I cooked something on a hot plate that I can only describe as a warning, and I sat on the floor because I had no chair, and I ate about a third of it, and then I sat there in the dark for a while and I noticed something. There was a gap between me and dinner. I had been hungry for 2 hours before I ate. 2 entire hours of a gap that nobody closed. That was the first time in 5 months I had wanted something and had to go and get it, and the terrible food tasted like being alive, and I sat on that floor and laughed out loud on my own like a man who needs supervision. So I started keeping track. Not a list. I am done with lists. I just noticed, and I remember them all. The chair was first. Bought it from a second-hand place on Kell Street for $14 and I looked at 4 of them and sat in all 4 and picked the ugly one because it was the right height. Nobody helped me. Nobody had it delivered. I carried a chair 1.5 miles through the city on my back and it was the proudest afternoon of my adult life. Then a specific coffee, ground, from the place on Fenwick where the men had been overcharging me for 2 years, and I went in and told him I knew, and he went bright red, and now he does not overcharge me and we get along fine. Wren had priced his building. I used 1 sentence and a Tuesday morning. I am not claiming my method works on everybody, but it was cheaper. Then a Tuesday I gave away to nothing at all on purpose. Every one of those was smaller than a pallet, and every one of them was mine. I stayed on at Marrow Lane through the wind down, because Merrick asked me to and because I wanted to see it out. Stripping a depot is a strange job. It goes faster than you think, and then one day the racking is gone and you can see the whole floor at once, and the building turns out to be smaller than the version of it that lived in your head. They took the cold plant out in the last 2 weeks and the hum stopped. 30 years of that building making a sound, and then it did not, and everybody who worked there walked around for a week talking too loudly, because we had all been pitching our voices over a noise that was no longer there. Merrick and I walked through the bay at the north wall on one of the last nights. It was empty concrete with 4 bolt patterns in it and a rectangle of clean floor where a house had stood. He looked at it for a while and then he said, "My wife thinks I love this building." I said, "Do you?" He said, "No. Building is a building." Then he pointed at the clean rectangle with his boot and said, "I worked here 22 years and the one time somebody built a home in it, we tore it out. That is the whole of it, I think." Then he went to check a door, because he is not a man who stands still and talks about feelings for more than 9 seconds, and I stayed in that empty bay on my own for a while afterward, looking at 4 bolt holes in a concrete floor. Sundays came back, and out of everything that happened to me in that whole year, that is the piece I would keep if somebody made me choose only one. If I could keep one piece of that whole year it would be this one. 2 buses out to Holloway, 1 hour 10 minutes, a 16-year-old waiting at the end of the road with her arms folded pretending she had just happened to be standing there. The first Sunday she was still furious and we walked around a park for 2 hours barely talking. By the 4th we were arguing about something stupid, and by the 6th she was telling me things about school she would not have told me in November, because in November her brother was a phone number that got answered by somebody else. He had put up one strip of the wallpaper. Not the wall. One strip, about as wide as a door, on the side of her room where the bed is, and the rest of the rolls are in the cupboard. I asked her why she did not do the whole wall. She said, because then it is a room from before, and I do not want to live in before. 16 years old. Sometimes I think my sister got all of it and I got the height. She asked about Wren every single week. Every week. And she asked in the most Junie way possible, which was, "So, is your kidnapper eating?" On the 3rd Sunday my aunt met me at the gate instead of Junie, and that is never good, and told me she was giving notice. Her name is Beverly and she is my mother's older sister and she has had my sister living in her back bedroom since Junie was 11 years old. She is not a warm woman and she has never pretended to be, and for 5 years she has done a thing every single day that she never volunteered for. She said, "I am 61. Her husband's hours had gone up, her knee was bad, and she had a life she had been meaning to get back to since the spring of the year my mother died. She said, end of the summer. I am sorry, Callum. I have been sorry for about 2 years. And in my pocket was a phone with a number in it, and if I had sent 4 words to that number, the entire problem would have ceased to exist before I got to the bus stop. Not solved. Ceased. She would have had somewhere for Junie by Tuesday and it would have been better than anywhere I could ever afford, and she would have done it gladly, and she would never have mentioned it again. I got as far as writing it. I stood on the sidewalk in Holloway with a message on a screen that said, "Beverly is giving notice," and my thumb about a centimeter above the send. Then I put the phone in my pocket, because the last time I handed my sister to that woman she had come to a fence on 3 buses and told me I had outsourced her, and she had been right, and you do not get to learn that lesson twice. So I went back through the gate and I sat in Beverly's kitchen for 2 hours and asked her the question nobody had asked her in 5 years, which was, what would actually make this workable? It was not money. I had walked up the path assuming it was money, because money is the only lever a tired man believes in, and I was wrong. She said, I have taken her to every appointment, every parents' evening, every dentist, every argument about a phone, every one of the bad nights in the first 2 years, and I have done all of it on my own, and the whole time there has been a brother, and the brother sends an amount on the 28th. She said, you have been paying me to be her family. I would rather have had the help. That landed somewhere I did not enjoy, and it landed with my sister's voice attached to it, and Wren's, and it made a set. So we made a new arrangement, out loud, in a kitchen, with nothing written down. I take every Sunday, which I already did, and one weeknight, which meant reorganizing my roster and losing the Wednesday premium. I take the school administration, the dentist, and the arguments about the phone, which are the worst of the lot and which I am terrible at. Beverly gets her Wednesdays back and her spring back and a niece who stays until she is 18. Took me 3 weeks and 2 humiliating phone calls to a school registrar, and the arrangement has held ever since. I never told Wren about any of it while it was happening. She found out 3 weeks later, from Junie, in one of their text message wars, and she asked me about it at our hour that Thursday. She said, Beverly gave notice in April. I said, yes. She said, you did not tell me. I said, no. And Wren Halvard sat in a cafe with empty hands and thought about that for a good while, and then she said, thank you, and it took me until the bus home to work out that she meant it completely and that it had cost her something to say. Money was its own comedy. Wren had paid 1 month on that apartment, and I decided I was going to pay it back, and she refused it. Refused it politely and completely, 4 times, until I stopped offering. So I started sending it to the company instead. $40 at a time, against the corridor hold, which cost more than I will earn in 20 years. $40 against that is not a repayment, it is a gesture, and gestures are what people do when the real thing is out of reach. Odile Halvard called me after the 3rd payment and said, Mr. Reed, there is a recurring credit on my regional ledger with no invoice attached and it is making my reconciliations ugly. I said, I know. She said, are you going to stop? I said, no. There was a pause, and then Odile said, all right, I will code it to miscellaneous, and I swear to you that woman was laughing, although she would deny it in any court. Wren and I saw each other once a week, for 1 hour, in public, and we had rules. I set them and she agreed to all of them without argument, which should have been my first clue that she was going to find a way around every single one. Rule 1, 1 hour. Rule 2, somewhere with other people in it. Rule 3, she does not bring anything. Not a coffee, not a coat, not a bag of oranges from the yard market, nothing, not one item. She never once broke Rule 3. Not literally. She arrived with empty hands every week for 8 weeks. What she did instead was arrive 40 minutes early and stand in the line and then step out of it when I got there so that I was near the front. Once she picked a cafe I had never heard of and it turned out to be 4 doors down from a walk-in clinic, and when I asked why, she said, "Because you have been rubbing your right shoulder for 2 weeks and you were going to keep not doing anything about it." I said, "Wren, that is providing." She said, "That is knowing. I am allowed to know things. If you take knowing away from me there is nothing left in there at all." I let her have knowing. It was the right call. 2 people in a cafe learning to talk without a warehouse around them, and neither of us was any good at it. She would go quiet for 4 minutes at a stretch. I would fill the quiet with noise and then hate myself. Once she said, "This is very hard." I said, "Which part?" She said, "All of it. Every week I sit down at that table with nothing in my hands and I have to be worth the hour on my own. I have never had to do that. I have always come with something." I said, "You are worth the hour." She looked at the table and said, "You say that and I hear it, and it goes in, and then it drains out again by Tuesday. I do not know how other people keep it in." I said, "You keep it in by hearing it on Tuesday as well." She said, "From who?" And I did not have an answer, and that question sat in me for about 3 weeks like a stone in a shoe. Marrow Lane closed on the 2nd Thursday of May. The handover was at 11 at night, because that is when the last shift cleared, and there was no ceremony, because there never is. A man from the parcel company came with a folder. A locksmith stood by the gate. 6 of us from the crew stood around in the yard drinking bad coffee out of the last of the paper cups. Wren did the final walk alone. It took her an hour and 20 minutes. I know because I stood in the yard and watched the lights go off behind her, section by section, all the way down the building, north end to the docks. She was switching off a place her grandfather had bought in 1971, in the dark, on her own, with a clipboard. She came out at 10 past midnight and handed the folder to the man from the parcel company and shook his hand and thanked him for his time. And then she stopped. I have never seen anything like it and I hope I never do again. She stood in that yard about 20 feet from the door with her arms hanging at her sides and she did not know what to do next. Not grief. She was not crying. It was something much worse than crying. It was a woman standing at the exact moment her hands ran out of a job, with nothing on the radio and nothing on the tablet and nothing in the building behind her, and no idea whatsoever how a person occupies a body that is not currently supplying something to somebody. She stood there for about 40 seconds. Nobody went to her. The other 5 did not go to her because she is a Halvard and you do not, and I did not go to her because I was standing in that yard finally understanding what I had spent an entire winter being on the receiving end of. Then she walked to her car and drove to Kell Street, because there was a 2 in the morning intake at Kell Street and she had put herself on it. I got Odile on the phone the next day and asked her one question. I said, "When did Wren last take a day off?" "Not a vacation." "A day." There was a long silence and some keyboard noise, and then Odile Halvard, Regional Operations Director, a woman who prints things, said, "Define off." I said, "Not rostered, not on call, not carrying the radio, not answering the phone, not at a site." He said, "Then never." She has been on the roster since she was 12. There are 291 entries in this system with her name on them and not one of them is a leave request. She has taken exactly no days. She does not know how to file it, and I am the person who would have to approve it, and she has never asked. I said, "If she asked, would you approve it?" Odile said, "She is not going to ask." I said, "That is not what I asked you." And there was another pause, and then that dry, dreadful, precise woman said, "Mr. Reed, if somebody put a leave request for my niece on my desk tomorrow morning I would sign it before I took my coat off." I said, "I do not work for you anymore. I cannot file anything." She said, "No. But you are the only person on this earth she has ever wanted anything from, and in 7 months she has not asked you for one thing, and you might want to sit down and work out why that is." Then she hung up, because Halvards do that. I sat on an ugly chair I had carried a mile and a half through the city, in a room with a window that looked at a wall, and I thought about a girl of 16 coming home at 5:20 in the morning after 4 hours in a freezing box, and a woman raising one finger to mean wait, and a 9-minute phone call with Rotterdam. I thought, all right. Then I got up and went to find my sister and a forklift driver, because I had 2 weeks to build somebody a room and no money at all. Everything I had ever watched that woman do was out of reach. She could put a house inside a warehouse. I had $11 in a jar and an ugly chair. If I tried to compete on objects, I would be handing her a worse version of the thing she was already the best in the country at, and she would have been kind about it, and it would have been the saddest afternoon of both our lives. So I sat on that chair for 2 evenings and worked out what she had actually done for me underneath the pallets. She had taken the load off. The rest was packaging, which meant the only real gift available to me was to take a load off her, and there was exactly one load, and it was the entire eastern region of a national cold chain, and I had 2 weeks. I went to a deal first. She saw me in a serviced office near the river, because Marrow Lane no longer existed, and she listened to the whole thing without interrupting once. Not her habit. I said, I need 11 hours. Not a vacation, not a weekend. 11 hours where nothing in that region can reach her. No radio, no tablet, no phone, no escalation, no 2 in the morning intake, nothing. And I need it in writing, because if it is a favor she will feel it as a debt and she will work twice as hard on Sunday to pay it back. Odile said, you have thought about this. I said, I have thought about nothing else since you hung up on me. She opened a drawer and took out a form. She filled it in herself, in pen, standing up, and she made a small noise in her throat when she got to the box marked reason. She said, what do I put here? I said, put annual leave. Whatever the boring one is. If you put anything interesting, she will read it as an intervention and she will refuse it out of pride, and then she will file it away and take it out and look at it on bad nights for the rest of her life. Odile looked at me over the top of the paper and said, you are extremely irritating and you are exactly right. Then she wrote the boring one, and signed it, and put the date on it, and said, 11 years I have had a leave book with a hole in it. Then she pushed it across the desk and said, do not waste it, and then she went back to whatever she had been doing before I walked in, because Wren Halvard does not do endings and never has. Merrick was harder, and Merrick mattered a great deal more, because a leave form is only a piece of paper and Merrick was the part of the plan that had to be a person. I found him on the pick line at Kell Street, where they had put him, and I bought him the bad coffee and I said, I need you to be the person she can call. He said, she can call anybody. I said, no she cannot, and that is the problem. There is a list in her head of people she is allowed to need and it has nobody on it. I need one name on it, and it has to be somebody who has been on a dock for 22 years, because she does not respect anybody who has not. Merrick drank his coffee and thought about it for a long time. Then he said, when she was maybe 9 years old, she used to sit on the packing bench and count the trailers coming in. All day. Out loud. Nobody asked her to. He said, I have wondered about that for 14 years. I said, will you do it? He said, give me the number, and then he wrote it on the inside of his own hand with a pen off the clipboard, which is where a man of that age puts a number he does not intend to lose. Junie was the last piece of it, and she turned out to be the one who stood in a kitchen in Holloway and told me that my entire plan was wrong. I explained it to her on a Sunday in Holloway, all of it, the leave form and the 11 hours and the apartment, and I was proud of myself, and my sister listened to the entire thing and then said, so it is you again. I said, what? She said, 1 room and 1 person handling everything. Callum, that is the same room. You are building her the same room. You just moved it to Ardley and made it uglier. And I sat down on a wall in Holloway because she was absolutely right, and I had come within a week of doing the exact thing that had nearly hollowed me out, with the roles swapped, in a smaller space, out of love. I said, so what do I do? Junie said, put people in it. Not just you. Being looked after by one person who has decided you are their whole job is not being looked after, it is being owned, and you of all people should know that by now. Then she said, and I am coming, obviously. I have been arguing with that woman by text message since March and she still thinks she is winning. I said, since March. Junie said, family business. Wren Halvard called me on the Tuesday, 2 days before the whole thing was supposed to happen, and she very nearly took it apart. I had never spoken to that woman in my life. She had my number, obviously. She opened with both halves of my name and asked whether it was a convenient time, which is a sentence I had spent 3 years learning to hate from an entirely different man. She was warm. That is what I was not ready for. She asked how my sister's school year had gone and she knew which school, and she said something kind about my mother that she could only have gotten out of a file, and it did not sound like a file when she said it. Then she said, I understand you are planning something for Wren on Thursday. I said, yes. She said, good. And then she said, I would like to help. She named a street and she named a figure. The street was 4 minutes from Holloway. The figure was for a house. She said, darling, you cannot look after her in one room with a hot plate in it. Let me put the two of you somewhere you can. I stood in a stairwell on Ardley with a telephone against my ear and heard, in a warm and entirely reasonable voice, the same sentence she had said to her own daughter down a line from Lisbon in March. If you need somebody to be somewhere, buy them a house. I said, no thank you. She said, think about it for a day. I said, I do not need a day. Your daughter got told that sentence once already and it cost her 11 months and a warehouse to work out what it does to a person. There was a pause on that line I have thought about ever since. It was not offended and it was not angry. It was a woman checking one figure against another and finding that they matched. Wren Halvard said, that is a very good answer, and I am afraid it will stop being true one day, and I would like you to call me when it does. Then she wished me a pleasant evening, and the line went quiet, and I sat down on the stairs. I bought the sign in the site clearance auction. When a depot goes, everything that is not nailed down gets listed, and quite a lot of what is nailed down gets listed too, and it goes in job lots to men with vans. Lot 211 was a box of aisle placards from Merrow Lane, hanging metal, white letters on green, and I paid $9 for the box and threw away all of them except one. Aisle 11. It is about as long as my arm and it has 2 bolt holes in the top and it weighs more than you would think. I got a second chair, so that there would be 2. I got a third off Merrick, so that there would be 3. I cleaned an apartment that is 1 room and does not take long to clean. I bought food that I intended to cook badly, on purpose, because the one thing I had that she did not was the willingness to hand somebody something imperfect. And on the last Thursday in May, at 4 in the morning, I got on a bus and went to Kell Street. She was on the dock with the radio in her hand. I want to describe her properly, one more time, because this is the last time I will get to. Wren Halvard, 23 years old, in a company jacket with the collar up, standing in a lit doorway at 4 in the morning at the top of a loading dock, watching a reversing trailer with her whole attention, calling the driver in by 1/8 of a meter. She had been on shift since 4 the previous afternoon. She saw me and her face did the thing it does, which is nothing, and then she came down the dock steps and said, "Are you hurt?" I said no. She said, "Is your sister hurt?" I said, "No." And then I held out my hand and said, "Radio." She looked at my hand. She said, "What?" I said, "Radio, tablet, phone. All 3. Right now, on the dock, in front of everybody." She said, "Callum, there is a 2 in the morning intake still open and a driver on his way in from the north with a hydraulic problem, and I have 412 cases going out at 9. And there it was. 412 cases. The same number she had thrown at me in November when I asked her to keep me and her whole mind fell over. So I did the thing I had spent 2 weeks getting ready to do. I said, "The intake is Marek's, he has been briefed, he has the sheet and he has your notes. The driver from the north is Devlin and the hydraulic is a known fault and O'Deal has already authorized a swap tractor and it came out of the river yard 40 minutes ago. The 412 cases are picked, wrapped and staged on Bay 2, and I know that because I helped stage them last night." She said, "I know you did. Bay 2, midnight to 4, on Marek's crew, in the gray coat. I watched you on the yard camera for about 10 minutes and then I made myself stop watching and go and do the intake." He said, "I have been letting you have things without saying anything about them since March. It is the hardest thing I have ever taught myself and not one person has noticed me doing it." I said, "I noticed. Give me the radio." Then I took a piece of paper out of my jacket and put it in her hand. She read it. It took her a while. It is not a complicated document, and she read it about 4 times, and then she looked up and said, in a completely wrecked voice, "This is signed." I said, "Your aunt signed it standing up." She said she has been waiting 11 years. Wren said, "I did not ask for this." I said, "I know. That is the point of it. You do not have to ask." And then Wren Halvard, who had run a corridor hold on 41 trucks without her voice changing, who had walked an entire depot dark on her own with a clipboard, stood on a loading dock at 4:10 in the morning holding a leave form and started to come apart at the edges in front of 9 of her own staff. She said, "I do not know what I am supposed to do for 11 hours. I said, "Nothing. That is the entire job. Give me the radio." She gave me the radio. Her hand was shaking. Merrick came out of the dark at the end of the dock and took it off me and said, one word, in Polish, that I have never asked him to translate, and then he said, "Go, I have it," and he turned around and started shouting at a driver, and that was that. We took the bus. I did that on purpose too. The 440 from Kell Street connects to the Ardley route, and the Ardley route stops at the stop where she used to stand at 11 meters in the dark watching a man wait for a bus he was always 7 minutes late for. We sat in the second row. She sat with her hands in her lap like a woman at a hearing. At the Ardley stop she looked out of the window at the shelter and said, I stood there 406 times. I said, I know. And at some point I am going to want the whole list. Not today. She said, why not today? I said, because today you do not have to supply me with anything at all, including your own history. She was quiet the rest of the way. When we got off she stopped on the sidewalk outside my building and looked up at it, all 4 floors of gray brick with the drainpipe down the front, and she said, I have never been inside. I said, I know. You asked me not to come and I did not come. 8 weeks. And she said, I stood on this sidewalk about 30 times. I said, obviously you did. Come upstairs. There is a metal sign bolted above the door of my apartment on Ardley. Green, with white letters, about as long as my arm. It says aisle 11, and it is the only thing in that building that ever came out of a warehouse. She saw it from 3 steps down the stairwell and stopped, with one hand on the rail, and did not say anything for a while. Then she said, you kept a piece of it. I said, I bought a box of them for $9 and threw the rest away. She said, which is the correct thing to have done, and her voice had gone completely to pieces, and she went past me through the door without looking at me. The apartment is 1 room. There is a hot plate, a sink with a tap that drips, a bed under the window, and 3 chairs, and none of the chairs match. She stood in the middle of it and did the thing I had done in November, which was turn around slowly, and I got to watch a person take in a room somebody had prepared for them, and it is a strange feeling to be on that end of it. Then I said my 3 terms, because I had been saving them for 2 weeks. I said, 1. Nothing in this room is your problem. Not the tap, not the shopping, not the fact that the second chair is broken at the back. If it needs doing, it is mine. I said, 2. You do not decide anything today. Not what we eat, not when, not whether the window is open. If a question has 2 answers, do not bring it to me, because I have already picked. She said, and 3. I said, 3. There is no lock on that door. It opens from both sides, it always has, and if you walk out of it I will not follow you down the stairs. And Wren Halvard sat down on the ugly $14 chair and put her hands flat on her knees like a woman waiting for a bus that is not coming. She lasted 14 minutes. 14 minutes she stood up and opened the cupboard above the sink, and said, this is stacked wrong, the heavy things are on the top shelf, and started taking them down. I took the tin out of her hand and put it back on the top shelf and said, no. At 20 minutes she said, your tap is dripping, it is a washer, I can do it in 4 minutes if you have a wrench. I said, no. At 35 minutes she got her phone out of her jacket, and I put my hand over it, and she said, I am only checking the time. I said, there is a clock on the wall, and it is behind you, and you have not looked at it once, and I did not put it there for decoration. An hour and 10 she made a run at it properly. She said, all right, I have thought about this, I will accept the day, but let me do one thing. There is a market on Kell Street on Thursdays and I can be back in 40 minutes with something better than whatever you were planning, and you can watch me not make a single decision for the rest of the day. Name it. Name anything and I will go and get it. Name it. 11 months of that woman's love, in 2 words. I said, no. She said, Callum. I said, no. That is the whole of my answer and I am going to keep giving it to you all day. You do not get to buy your way out of the room. Not with oranges, not with a washer, not with anything. And she said, in a small hard voice, then what am I for? I said, sit down. I am making lunch and it is going to be bad. It was bad. It was genuinely bad, and I had rehearsed it twice, so that is not even an excuse. I burned the onions and undercooked the rice and it went on 2 plates that do not match, and I put one in front of her and sat down opposite and watched her eat it the way she had watched me eat those atrocious potatoes at Christmas. She got about halfway through and then she put the fork down and said, I have to go. And she went. Coat, door, stairs. I stayed in the chair. I am going to give you those 8 minutes properly, because they are the only stretch of this entire story in which nothing whatsoever happens, and they are the part one would keep over all the rest of it. Minute 1, I heard the street door go. Minute 2, I stood at the window and she was on the sidewalk with her back to the building, not walking anywhere, just standing. Minute 3 she started walking, and I sat back down, because watching from a window is one thing and leaning out of it is another. Minutes 4 and 5 I did nothing at all. I have never done nothing at all with that much effort in my life. Every instinct I own was telling me to get down those stairs and fix it, and fixing it meant going after her, and going after her meant the door only ever opened one way after all. Minute 6 I ate a forkful of the bad rice standing up, for something to do with my hands. Minute 7 I understood that if she did not come back I had no plan of any kind, and that this was correct, and that having a plan for her had been the whole disease from the beginning. Minute 8 the street door went again. I had not followed her down the stairs, because I had said I would not, and because a door that opens from both sides is worth exactly nothing if somebody is standing in it. She came in without knocking and stood inside the door and said, "I got to the corner." I said, "I know. I could see you from the window for the first 3 of them, and then I made myself sit down, and I would do it exactly the same way again." She said, "Why did you not come after me?" I said, "Because you told me in November why the door had no lock. You said if you took the key, then one day I would have to ask you for permission to leave, and you would have to be the kind of person who decides, well, same rule. It runs both ways, or it is not a rule, it is a preference." And that was the thing that did it. Not the sign, not the leave form, not the bad lunch. She had told me on a couch in December that she had no plan for the word no, and I had just spent 5 hours handing her nothing else. Wren Halvard stood just inside the door of a one-room apartment on Ardley with her coat still on and came apart completely, and it was not beautiful. That was the 3rd time, and the last, and it was nothing like the other 2. People say that grief is beautiful and it is not, it is loud and it is ugly and it goes on far longer than is comfortable for everybody in the room. She got out about 4 sentences in the middle of it and I have all 4. She said, "I do not know how to be on this side." She said, "Everybody I have ever loved, I have loved by supplying them, and if I am not supplying you then I am just a person sitting in a chair and there is no reason for anybody to keep me." She said, "I have been on the roster since I was 12. And she said, "Nobody has ever once come to get me. So I did the only thing I actually know how to do, the same thing I did when I was 17 in a yard on the Ring Road, and it is not a skill and it is not clever and it does not fix anything." I did nothing. I did not talk her out of it, I did not correct any of the 4 sentences, I did not go and get her a glass of water so that I would have something to hold. Pulled the second chair over and I sat down next to her on the floor by the door and I stayed there until she stopped. It took about half an hour. Then she said, in a completely flat and ordinary voice, "I am extremely tired." I said, "I know. Go to sleep." She said, "It is 1 in the afternoon." I said, "Yes." She fell asleep on the ugly chair sitting up, mid-sentence, at 1:10, the same way she had at Christmas, and I put a blanket over her that I had bought for the purpose. And I sat on the floor with my back against the bed and watched a woman sleep in the middle of a working day for 4 hours. The leave form ran out at 3 in the afternoon. Nobody woke her to tell her. Merrick held the radio until 9 at night and filed the extra 6 hours against his own overtime, and when I tried to thank him for it he told me the coffee at Kell Street was still bad and walked off down the dock. When she woke up at 5:10 there were people in my apartment. Junie was at the table with her homework spread out over both plates. Merrick had come off shift and let himself in with the door I had left on the latch, and he had brought a bag of food from the Polish place on Kell Street and put it on the hot plate and said nothing about anything, and then had sat down on the 3rd chair and gone through a newspaper for an hour like a man in a waiting room. Wren opened her eyes and saw 3 people in a one-room apartment and went completely rigid. Junie did not look up from her homework. She said, "Morning. Your last message was aggressive and also wrong." Wren said, "It was not wrong." Junie said, "It was wrong twice." And they were off, and Merrick turned a page, and I stood at the sink filling a kettle, and that is the moment I would keep out of all of it. Not the sign, not the speech, an apartment with 4 people and 3 chairs in it and an argument about text messages going on across a table. Because my sister had been right in Holloway. 1 person, 1 room, 1 set of hands doing everything for you is not care. I had lived inside the most beautiful version of that arrangement anybody has ever built and it emptied me out in 11 weeks. The cure was never a better provider. It was more than 1 door into the same room. Later, when Merrick had gone and Junie was on the phone to our aunt about the last bus, Wren and I stood by the window and I named what I wanted, which I had never once done in that whole first winter. I said, "I want next Sunday." She said, "All right." I said, "I have not finished. I want next Sunday and the one after that, and I want you off the roster 1 day in 7 for the rest of your life, and I want you to file it yourself, on paper, in your own handwriting, so that there is a leave book somewhere with your name in it more than once." I said, "I want to be the one who cooks badly. I have earned that." And I said, "And I want you to ask me for something. Out loud, in words, before Thursday. Not a hint and not a thing you have arranged so that I will notice it. I have been asked for nothing by you for 7 months and it is the only thing you have ever short-changed me on." She looked out of the window at the wall of the next building for a long moment. Then she said, "When you come into a room." I said, "Yes." She said, count. Count how many people are in it and say the number out loud. Even if it is one. Especially if it is one. She said, in that yard, on the ring road, there were 11 people on shift and I was the 12th and nobody counted, and I have been standing in rooms ever since waiting to find out whether I am in the number. So that is what I do. Every room, out loud, whether she is in it or not. It took me about 4 months to stop feeling stupid about it and I have not stopped doing it since. It has been a year and a half. Wren works 6 days a week, not 5, and she is never going to be a 5-day person, and I have made my peace with it. Odile has a leave book with 70-odd entries in it now, all in the same small square handwriting, and she told me once that she takes it home sometimes, which I do not believe, and which I choose to believe. Wren Halvard has been to the apartment twice, and both times she stood up after 40 minutes because there was a call. I have stopped asking, and she has stopped bracing for the question, and that is as far as that has gotten in a year and a half. It's not fixed. Some of it does not get fixed. There is a couch in Wren's office at the new site and she sleeps on it about twice a month, which counts as progress, because a couch means you meant to. Merrick is in her phone under his own name, not under a job title. Pavel, who does the gate controllers, is the third name on that list, and he has never been called, and he knows he is on it, because she went and told him, which is how she does things. Merrick has been called twice. Both times at 3 in the morning, and both times she called him first and me second, which was the arrangement, and which I recommend to anybody. Junie has one strip of green wallpaper with little birds on it beside her bed and the rest of the rolls in a cupboard, and she is 18 now and studying something with numbers in it, and she still sends Wren aggressive text messages, and Wren still thinks she is winning. We live on Ardley. It is one room and the tap still drips, because I keep saying I will do it and I keep not doing it, and she keeps not doing it either, which for her is an act of enormous love. The sign is still over the door. People ask about it and we tell them it came out of a warehouse, which is true, and we do not tell them the rest. Every evening when I come up those stairs and push the door open, before my coat is off, I stand there and I count the room out loud. Most nights the number is 2.
A man walks into a freezing warehouse and asks a woman to take his whole life off him, and she does it so completely that 960 packets of instant noodles turn up on a pallet the next morning. And inside 11 weeks he has said the words, "You pick 431 times," and lets his own mother's name be said wrong at his own table without looking up. That is not what breaks him. What breaks him is that none of it hurt. And the woman who built the cage is the one who works it out first, standing in a puddle of her own spilled water, because she had fallen in love with a man who carried 4 impossible things at 4 in the morning, and she had spent a winter carefully taking all 4 of them away. Being carried is not the opposite of drowning. Somebody has to want something, and the want that never once has to wait stops being a want at all, and the tenderest thing anyone ever did for either of them was refuse. She refused him a lock in November. He refused her a bag of oranges in May. And in a yard on the ring road years earlier, 11 people worked a full shift and nobody counted to 12. Count the room. Say the number.